Welcome back. Welcome, everybody. And for those of you who have just joined us now, welcome to the AI Policy Conference. We are very pleased to count you among the participants, and we look forward to your active participation. My name is Sanja Fabrio. I'm a co-founder and managing director of RegHorizon, and I will be your host for the conference, or co-host with ETH Zurich. I will also be a moderator for the upcoming panel on AI policy in healthcare. What a great insights we had yesterday and today. We so far heard how important it is to build transparency and to build safety, obviously, and evidence about its effectiveness before we can deploy it. We have heard about how accountable and safe AI solutions need to be explained to consumers, and businesses need to rely on them before they can adopt them and scale. We heard also just now before this panel started how important it is to align the regulatory frameworks and what Europe and some other jurisdictions are focusing on to be able to uphold this innovation, but also reassure the users and those who deploy them. We yesterday talked about trustworthy developing or developers and deployers of the AI. And we're going to be talking about some of these questions today as well. Before though, just as a warm-up, I'd like to test some of these insights also through a poll. So you will obviously have, we have a great panel I'm going to introduce in a second. You will all have the possibility to ask questions, but as a warm-up, I'd like to ask you a question. So here's a poll. Will you accept, obviously having been disclosed that it is an AI, examination, diagnostics, and or treatment with assistance of AI? So the answers from yes, some of them, not at all. Please, it's going to be closed in a few seconds. We'd like to have as many answers as we can, just to test waters to see what people actually think about using AI in healthcare. All right, so interesting. So we have people, most of the people saying we'll accept all of the above. So examination, diagnostics, and treatment using AI. I guess we're going to have some of these results being commented during the great panel we have. So as I said, please use the chat. We will have some time to ask, obviously, questions from the chat. It's going to be a mostly Q&A based session. We have a great panel that I'll introduce in a second, but we want to have your active involvement. So please ask the questions. And then panelists have graciously also agreed to stay on during the coffee break. So after the panel closes, you will have a possibility to join them in a separate room and continue the conversation for any questions that we may have not answered. Okay, great. So let me introduce the panel we have today. I have a great pleasure to have with us Dr. Ceri Thompson, who is a Vice Head of Unit for eHealth, Wellbeing and Aging of DG CONNECT in European Commission. Ceri's experience stretches over several units in EU Commission, including DG Santé, including Eurostat, and before that also UK's Department for International Development. Welcome, Ceri. We also have with us Dr. Khozin, who is a Global Head of Data Science Innovation for Janssen R&D. It's the pharmaceutical companies of Johnson & Johnson. Sean was also for 5 years until the end of last year in FDA's Oncology Center for Excellence, where he was heading center's bioinformatics efforts, as well as founder of Information Exchange and Data Transformation, short Informed, of FDA's first data science and technology incubator, designed as an agile sandbox. And before his tenure, Sean also co-founded Hello Health, focused on telemedicine. Sean is not only expert, I must say, in healthcare, he's also a musician. And music that you've heard in the previous jingle that was just playing before we started is composed by him and performed by his band. So welcome, Sean. Together with us is Professor Dr. Philippe Ryvlin, who is the head of Department of Clinical Neurosciences at CHUV. Welcome, Philippe. CHUV is Vaud's University Hospital based here in Lausanne, Switzerland, and he will bring us the invaluable perspective of healthcare practitioner. We also welcome Gilles Lunzenfichter, who is a CEO and co-founder of Medisanté, whose global cloud-based medical IoT platform helps healthcare providers to scale their remote patient monitoring efforts. And it operates globally. So it's going to be interesting to hear how we can reap some of these data also for training AI algorithms. And of course, a warm welcome to Dr. Gabriel Krummenacher, lead of data science team at Zühlke Group. Gabriel has experience in data analytics and machine learning projects. He was a visiting researcher in Australia's ICT Research Centre of Excellence in Bioinformatics Group in Melbourne. And he also worked in the trading technology team at AXA Rosenberg in San Francisco. So thank you very much and great to have you all with us today. We have really a truly diverse panel, and I think with backgrounds that we have here from both regulators, entrepreneurs, businesses, it's going to be a very compelling discussion, and this is exactly what we need in order to advance the discussion on policy. So I would like to start with maybe Sean, you to start with, to kind of reap the benefits of your experience in both the regulator and the healthcare, you know, the business from that uses the AI. What actually would you say is what are the major elements for uptake of AI technologies in healthcare? So how, what would you say would be some of the major criteria, and what would be the some of the focus areas that we need to address to be able to scale AI quickly in healthcare?
Sure. Thank you, Sanja, and I'd like to thank you and your colleagues for inviting me to participate in this great conference. So I think one of the primary ways where we can help thoughtful scaling of AI solutions is by building trust. First and foremost, I think trust is the underlying theme behind AI as it pertains to the use of these methods in healthcare and in biomedical research and therapeutic development. And trust is something that is multidimensional, and it means different things to different people. One of the ways that, for example, we build trust in the medications we take and in the vaccines that we're developing that soon will be disseminated to address the pandemic currently, as an example. And one of the ways of building trust in these innovations is through the regulatory process, because we know that there's a scientific method that assures that these innovations are safe and effective. And I think a lot of AI innovations can fit in that category to the extent that they would be relevant to biomedical research and therapeutic development. So the regulatory mechanism we have is one way of building a certain level of trust, but it may not be suitable for AI innovations because not every AI innovation has to go through the regulatory process. Trust is also important to build among providers and physicians who would have to rely on the judgment of these algorithms to either support their decisions or to make certain types of diagnoses. It was very interesting to see the results of the poll that the majority of folks, at least folks that are participating in this session, do have a certain level of underlying trust in AI, which was in fact, more than I had anticipated. But that's the kind of trust that I think physicians, providers, and also consumers need in order to utilize these innovations to streamline their workflows and to help advance the interest of patients. And I think the role of policy is critical in this context because we need proactive policy versus reactive. I think when it comes to AI and anything that's algorithmic, we need to be very cautious and we need to be very proactive to create the appropriate incentives for these innovations to scale, and B, to make sure that we have the parameters in place that foster trust in these solutions and reduce some of the biases that may exist in these algorithms that can in fact propagate much more rapidly than biases that may exist in other types of decision making or other types of modalities that are used to tailor therapies or deliver medical interventions to people. So I think proactive policymaking is a critical component of making sure that not only these AI solutions appropriately scale and the right incentives are accessible, but also that we do it in a thoughtful and responsible manner, because there have been lessons learned from in the past couple of decades or so with how we use algorithms and, for example, social media platforms and things that we wish we had been more aware of maybe 5 years ago, or in some cases a decade ago. And I think some of those lessons we need to keep in mind as we develop a thoughtful and proactive policy approach to AI and its use, especially in biomedical research, therapeutic development, and ultimately healthcare delivery.
Thank you very much, Michelle. I think it's compelling, and it's actually very important to see how quickly we can scale some of these solutions, because from what we keep reading about a year ago and now with, as you said, all the efforts to come to a vaccine or to use it for drug discovery in general, we've made leaps that were huge, right? So all of that has been there. The question is how we can deploy it. And maybe I'll turn to Gabriel with this question. I think what Sean and I, just to build on some of the biases that are inherent in data. I mean, today when we talk about data in healthcare, we talk about a hodgepodge of things, right? We talk about data that are representing patients' recorded experiences, including those from remote patient monitoring that we'll be talking a little bit about also with Gilles just in a moment. Practices and policies, ways that some of these data are recorded in the healthcare environment, including biases of some of the specific healthcare settings, right? We also have the data that are being generated by patient-physician encounters. So I think that, Gabriel, what I'd like to ask you from the perspective of AI developers, how do we ensure that some of these AI solutions that we are building on such a diverse data are both performant and respectful of different settings, and how can policy help? And is there anything else that, except for policy, can actually help as well that we don't have?
Thanks a lot, Sanja. So I think, I mean, obviously the data that is being used to develop these models and train these algorithms is very crucial. I mean, whatever's in that data and however biased this data is, this will all directly translate into the performance of the algorithms, and basically the decisions these algorithms make are fundamentally based on this data. So this is a very important aspect for sure. So what people do that develop these models is the most crucial aspect of it is actually trying to get a good estimate of how well this algorithm will work when it's applied. So when it's actually being used. And this is a hard problem in general, because what you would need to ideally have is exactly the same kind of data that you will see when the product is being used. So you would want to already know like what kind of patients this product will be used on, how are they distributed, you know, how many people from what age group, with what pre-existing conditions, and so on and so forth. So the data that is used to train all these algorithms needs to very closely match the data that they will see when the product is being used by a medical doctor, for instance. So one way of doing this is trying to record data that is very close to this. And it's also, I mean, the other thing is to just describe this. I mean, knowing how this data looks like looking at all these factors in the data that is used to test the algorithms. So like what groups are in this data, and then figuring out the performance on these subgroups. So you don't just want to have like one aggregate performance metric of saying the algorithm like works in 90% of the cases, but you also want to know like how does it work on women and men? How does it work on old and young patients? How does it work on all these separate subgroups? So actually analyzing the performance of the model beyond just having these like somehow crude aggregate metrics is very important. And then the other thing is just having as much and diverse data as possible. So if the issue is that, I mean, there's always bias in the setting. So if you just have data from one healthcare provider or from one clinic, then it's not obvious that this would generalize to another setting. So actually having different settings in the training data and also having like a setting that you don't observe in the training data that can then be used to test is very important. So you don't want to mix, for instance, all the different clinics. So you can actually measure how well your method does if it's on data that was measured somewhere else. So you don't want to give that data to the training algorithm before you measure it.
Right. And then on the other hand, we actually are always data hungry, aren't we? We need to have a lot of data. We need to have real world data. So sometimes when we talk about a specific setting, the data we have are not necessarily large enough and potentially of relatively different quality. So the quality, accessibility, and ultimately availability of these data pools will be very important. And I think we'll talk a little bit about that with Ceri and the work that we are doing in EU on that. But before I move to that question, I'd like just to go loop this back to Gilles. And you know, you are actually working on a different access to data. We talk about remote monitoring of patients and being able to you know, upload this data in a completely different way. So respecting the privacy and ensuring that quite a lot of that is you know, aligned to expectations of ethics and how we use them going forward. So you know, from the policy perspective, to be able to do that, you are still finding blockages both on in terms of different regulatory frameworks and also reimbursement frameworks. So how can we, you know, advance some of these very important issues of patient support globally, while also keeping the data private or keeping patients at ease with what we actually do with the data that we record on them.
Yes, so thanks, Sanja, for asking the question. So a preliminary remark maybe is when we talk about AI in healthcare, probably 80 or 90% of AI we talk about relates to images. You know, it's images that are captured within the four walls of hospitals, of a healthcare provider, of a lab. But we know now with COVID-19 that the most important point where data should be captured when it really matters for confined elderly people, it should be the home of the patient. And unfortunately, I would say that if I take an analogy that AI is the brain. We're all hoping that it functions perfectly well and does the right thing for the patient. Unfortunately, where it really matters, which is chronic patients that right now are confined in the homes by hundreds of millions everywhere on Earth. In fact, these chronic patients, they represent at end of life 80% of the costs of healthcare anywhere in the world with local budgets, of course. In fact, the AI brain doesn't have the legs, the feet that would feed the brain, because there is no way right now with the consumer approach to connected devices to feed the data, the brain, the AI brain at scale. So this is exactly the problem we address. And so what I see is that indeed, you mentioned it, there is a huge disparity in terms of reimbursement policies in that area. So I would say that in Europe, what we have been seeing, because we have been looking at that market now for about 4 years, is that I believe the US is faster in putting blanket policies in place, that once they're in place, you know, things just happen. And to give you an example, and just as a way to compare the impact of policies, basically in the beginning of 2019, the American Medical Association, they issued some CPT codes so that CMS could reimburse, if you want, the physicians who are doing remote patient monitoring for patients who are above 65, let's say, in the USA, who have many comorbidities or chronic. And, you know, once this major step is done in terms of policy, because basically it's about setting priorities, how you take care of those patients when they are really ill. You know, I don't talk about people who count their step when they are 35 and they're, you know, in great shape, but they're just aware of health. No, here we talk about people who are chronic. And so they decided to put money on the table, you know. They have said, hey, every doctor in America who does remote patient monitoring as of today gets paid for it. And basically, to keep, not to be too detailed, but there are three so-called CPT codes by which if a doctor does take the technology and medical steps, you know, to be in a position to do these remote patient monitoring. So of course, there are connected devices, there are some communication technologies, there are some remote patient monitoring platforms involved. Basically, if he does it, he earns money. He can earn like over $1,000, you know, per year per patient. And so you imagine that once this is done, you know, every doctor, instead of saying, you know, I don't get paid for that, I'm overworked, finding basically the 50 excuses why it will never start, suddenly everybody starts to think of, hey, how will I make money doing this? Because this is the future. So in Europe, unfortunately, and I must say that we are pretty much nowhere in comparison. So I use these also as a platform to make the case for policy change. There have been experimentations, for instance, in France with a program, but it's experimentation. In Germany, there are also pretty advanced, you know, thinking and studies that showed that, for instance, for heart insufficient patients, it's obvious, you know, all the small-scale clinical studies that were done in multiple countries show that if you do the remote patient monitoring of heart insufficient patients, the first year you reduce mortality by 40%, 50% in one study, the other study, but it's a huge number. And you reduce between 20 and 40% rehospitalizations, which are huge costs. So it's pretty obvious that it can be done, right? But right now there is a policy disparity, and we should start to move the needle here, because right now all the healthcare professionals in Europe, they don't have access to this data. And basically elderly patients are deprived from care because technologically the healthcare professions in Europe are not equipped policy-wise and technology-wise with the tools, you know, to do it.
Right. I think just to build actually on a bit of a provocative comment that you are just making, Gilles. So what is Europe then thinking in terms of allowing some of these new technologies being deployed? And I turn to Ceri now. Ceri, you are on mute. So if you can just unmute you there. Yeah. You know, you and I were talking about the efforts that EU is doing in, you know, making data available with these data spaces. And I think it's very important for our participants also to hear what are the priorities there and how do we see the developments in this area in Europe?
Yes, thank you. Can you see me, by the way? Am I?
No, we can't.
Okay, I'm start the video. Do you see me with the background, or do you see me with the?
No, your camera doesn't seem to be on.
Okay, it is working at my end. Okay, well, I will start talking. Good. Well, thank you very much.
Yes.
You can hear me. Well, that's good. Yes. So I mean, we're still there's a number of things going on. I mean, just quickly, the policy framework is the 2018 Communication on Digital Transformation of Health and Care, which is still very valid. We're still working within these three objectives of firstly trying to get the citizens better access to their health data, encouraging innovation around digital tools and services, you know, and then critically, with the perspective of AI, connecting and sharing health data in order to bring the potential of AI to bear on research and innovation and clinical uses. And of course, then subsequently, we work in the context of the data strategy adopted in 2020, alongside the white paper on artificial intelligence that sets out the perspective for moving forward with a regulatory framework for artificial intelligence, and the data strategy, which foresees a series of data spaces connected through major investments in infrastructure, through major encouragement of the use and reuse of data from various sources. And of course, a key one of these data spaces is the health data space, which is now an important political goal of the European Commission, and to which we're all working. Now, of course, there are numerous challenges, which we know. We know that we know, as people have mentioned, that there's a lot of data languishing, unused in various places. We know that it's very, very fragmented. We know that a lot of this data, of course, is being collected. A lot of the health data that would be valuable for artificial intelligence is being collected, by your health and care provider in some way. And these entities, particularly, and there's a lot of variability between the countries and regions of Europe, but there's often a lack of appropriate processing and storage solutions. We know that we need to address and put in place appropriate governance frameworks for the data. We need to improve, we need to build capacity in the workforce. We need to build the literacy of citizens. We need to build the capacity of those who will use the data, whether it's clinicians or even in the industry sector. So there's a lot that we need to do. So in terms of the focus that we have, particularly here in DigiConnect, we're working on developing the volume of the data. We're working on making it interoperable, and to this end, we produced a recommendation last year, which is about setting a framework for the first time for member states to work together and create the right technical specifications that can see data easily shared, securely shared across borders. And we have quite a lot of work to build on that's already been done in relation to patient summaries and e-prescriptions. And we're going forward with the next tranche of health data topics. And we're putting around that a series of principles that will start for countries and healthcare systems to work together on, that will start to see health and care systems, which of course are highly fragmented, healthcare systems being the competence of member states in terms of the financing and running. So, but we'll start to lay the foundation for organizational interoperability, and then on top the technical and semantic interoperability that we're developing. And we're taking this work forward through a project which will deliver another series of technical specifications in the areas of medical images, hospital discharge letters, and lab tests. And in addition to that, we're working on very specific kinds of data. We're working particularly on electronic health records. We're working on genomic data. We have a process running with a number of member states, working with the competent authorities in member states, which will invest in development of infrastructure that can see this data for the first time being securely shared across borders, so that we have by 2022 at least 1 million accessible genomes for the research and innovation community and for clinical uses. And by 2025, 10 million. And we're working with disease and patient registries, and we're also working to develop particularly cancer images through a large centralized repository that can, of course, be very powerful in developing next generation diagnostic tools. Of course, another focus is on the frameworks for trust of this data, which is, of course, critical if we're going to all feel comfortable using the data, which is we're particularly focusing on ensuring the citizen trust as well, because if the citizen trust isn't there, citizens will not want to buy into a system or be part of a system where their data is shared and used. So the trust frameworks we're looking at, of course, in the areas of cybersecurity and data protection, we already have GDPR, but we are looking to come forward on a closer way of working around the secondary use of data. And this is something the German presidency currently has been also very engaged in, and also e-privacy aspects. And then, of course, we're looking to invest very much in the digital transformation of health and care systems with the next multi-annual financial framework, which should start in 2021, where we have a number of new programs. We continue to have the Horizon Europe program. Well, the Horizon program now renamed Horizon Europe, which we use to test proofs of concept, for example, in areas of the infrastructure that Europe needs to be able to securely share the data in the way that everyone can trust. We also are testing in this kind of program, methodologies around the use of anonymized and synthetic data, which would be a way to get the kind of testing data that we need for different parts of the innovation process, and easily be within the framework of GDPR. We've also got the new Digital Europe program, which will invest substantially in a number of aspects of infrastructures. It's also going to invest in capacity building, advanced skills, cutting-edge skills to address the shortage of digital experts that we see in the member states. We've got the new EU for Health program, which is currently sitting at a budget of above 5 billion, which will invest heavily in supporting, for example, health and care systems to digitally transform, as well as supporting the digital transformation of the regulatory processes around different kinds of innovation that needs to access the data, whether it's pharmaceuticals or medical devices. And we've also got the Recovery and Resilience Fund, which is this sort of brand new fund, which created to help Europe recover from the pandemic, which, as the President of the Commission, van der Leyen, said, 20% of this investment should go towards digital, so that we don't use these funds, not just to recover from the pandemic, but also to propel the EU into the future, into a digital future, and of course, particularly.
And it's interesting just to build on that, Ceri. We just heard from Robert Madlin, who is a chairman of FIPRA, but was also before in DG Sanko. A very interesting comment, which comes to very obvious one, actually, that we have seen that the most resilient companies during this pandemic crisis have been those that have embraced digital very early and would have used that throughout the crisis. So I think all the efforts that we are collectively doing on speeding up digitalization and use and certainly uptake of new technologies in the way that we operate will also protect us going forward from some of these downsides of crisis. With that, I think it's going to be also interesting to hear from the practitioners. So how do we make sure, Philippe, you are in the University Hospital in Switzerland, and you know, when we discussed, you said it's sometimes very interesting to see how little of these you know, AI applications are today present in the hospitals, maybe sort of imaging and you know, cancer detection. So what would it take? How can we potentially involve practitioners more in that? Is this all education and culture, or would it be a benefit of involving you know, practitioners early on in the development, so that we have kind of a joint input when AI applications are being developed for healthcare?
Thank you, Sanja. Well, I will come back to what Gilles has mentioned. I think it's extremely important, and I fully agree with his comment, that without a reimbursement scheme, there's no reason and no possibility to develop most of AI capacity in medicine, and not just for remote monitoring, which is obviously one of the very important use case. I might disagree with him only on one issue. Physician will not get rich with the reimbursement scheme that is available in the US, and that's a good thing, at least from a US or Swiss perspective. But the point is that this reimbursement should ensure that the physician will not lose money by implementing new policies that will benefit to the patient and to the society. And if you don't have any reimbursement scheme, that's just not going to happen. So you need a reimbursement scheme, which indeed the US do have, especially with Medicaid. It's not for a long time, it's recent, primarily since 2019. But for having a reimbursement scheme, you need authorities and regulatory authorities to approve device or AI algorithm software on specific medical indication. And the FDA in the US have built up a task force with experts in the field, numerous experts, and a fast track way to approve new AI that we also badly missing in Europe. To me, those are the main two issues. Now, of course, we have this problem that has been alluded by the other speakers: trust, transparency, data privacy. They are important issues, but I think it's also important to be pragmatic and to move away from being too much theoretical and sometimes fantasizing about those issues. They are not specific to AI. Being able first to ensure data privacy, you know, is generic to medicine. We're dealing every day in hospital, in private clinic, with medical sensitive data, and we have to protect them, and we know how to do it. Of course, it's more important and more crucial for AI, where data are really at the core, and often big data are the core of developing or running those applications. But it's not a specific issue to AI. The risk of bias indeed is inherent to AI, especially very large scale application. There has been a paper in Science last year that beautifully pinpoint this issue in the US, and it was a hidden bias towards the fact that some patient with some racial origin had less chance to be identified, are requiring higher level of care. So we need to be careful about this, but bias in access to care is also a very common issue. So we know how to tackle those problems, and we shouldn't make it an AI-specific threat. And transparency, indeed, is important. But you know, how many drugs are being prescribed every day for which we don't know the mechanism of action? And yet we use them in tens and hundreds of millions of patients. So that's not to downrate the importance of those issues, but by making them sometimes too specific to AI, I think we're not addressing the most important issue. The most important issue for physician, and I guess for patient, is performance. The true performance of whatever solution you propose for diagnostic or therapeutic. The risk of an error. And I think that's, you know, where we need to progress. But to progress on this, we need to be able to perform high level and high quality clinical study, like for any other medical intervention, diagnostic or therapeutic, drugs, medical device, vaccine. And for that, you need a reimbursement scale and a market that is clear. If you don't have a market, if there's no way for a good business model, there's no money to perform the clinical studies, and there's no way to ensure whether the solution is effective. So I think that, you know, most physicians are pragmatic. They just want to see demonstration that the different tools that are being developed are effective. And for that, we need to be able to perform the appropriate clinical studies.
Thank you. It makes very much sense. I mean, we always talk about incentives, right? So with that, thank you very much. I think this really set the scene. And I think we have a couple of questions in the audience. So Katerina, would you please summarize them for the panelists?
Yes. Hi, everyone. My name is Katerina Anzelkovic. I'm from the Diplo Foundation. First, I'd like to thank our panelists for their valuable insights. I really enjoyed the session. And here are some of the comments and questions made by our participants. They commented that considering the waiting lists in some countries, we would accept anything concerning to AI at this point. And I fully agree to that from a Serbian perspective. But they also noted that we have to be mindful of red herrings within the likelihood produced by the machine learning and biases of artificial intelligence. Wade also noted that applications of AI in forensics would present many prickly factors. And we have also received one question from Hina Sarfaraz. She would like to know, what are the panelists' views on surveillance of health data vis-a-vis privacy, cybersecurity, data protection, especially with regards to transfer of such data to third countries and its relation to AI policy? So that's everything from my end. Over to you, Sanja.
Thank you, Katerina. I think it's a great segue into second wave. So who would like to pick up on the last question?
If you allow, Sanja, I would like just to give my 2 cents. So how I see things is that right now we're on a collision course between a consumer approach to health, which is driven by global tech and device vendors who try to collect patient data. And when you start there, it's pretty complicated then to de-identify and end up meeting all the requirements, which are pretty basic ones to protect the privacy. I believe that there will be a tectonic shock between this overwhelming consumer approach that is prevalent today and a new approach that will emerge in the next 10 years, where for the first time, once there is reimbursement for remote patient monitoring, physicians' care teams will start to think, what do I need to do my job in terms of Internet of Things, collecting outside of the hospital, applying machine learning algorithm, artificial intelligence, etc. And I believe that today everybody believes that the consumer approach will be the one that will win. And I believe this is a wrong assumption. And everything the European Union today does starts with the consumer approach. But in fact, Philippe said it. You know, every hospital in Switzerland and anywhere else knows how to take care of patient data in their clinical systems. The whole point is to empower the doctors to apply these capabilities, collect data from chronic patients that are all in, currently they are not taken care of, you know, they're at home. The only way to feed the AI data is to empower the physicians, use the capabilities of the existing health IT systems that are perfect in terms of security and privacy. The only thing is that the new technologies need to be interoperable with those systems. This is the starting point. And if this is done, all the rest will be automatic. And my vision is that we need to empower physicians, we need to empower doctors with Internet of Things, and then, you know, the AI thing, it will be solved by itself.
John, I saw you nodding, so tell us what you think about it.
Sure. You know, I think there are many different dimensions to this. Again, however, I completely agree with the fact that right now in the direct-to-consumer space, there are, you know, several unprecedented opportunities. You know, the barrier to entry for a lot of startup companies to deliver healthcare solutions as AI applications has decreased. However, reimbursement remains to be a bottleneck. In the US, just a few days ago, CMS announced that they would reimburse the first 2 AI applications in the US. One is for diagnosing diabetic retinopathy using an AI system, and that has to do with the fact that imaging is one of the low-hanging fruits for AI. The other one is also imaging related for diagnosing stroke in the acute setting. So, you know, reimbursement is certainly a catalyst, and I think it's really incumbent on policymakers and federal authorities to be very proactive, and that's what I meant by the fact that we need proactive policies versus reactive, because this is a wave that is coming, and it's not going to stop. And if we don't provide the appropriate incentives while making sure that we have the right parameters, cybersecurity and patient privacy parameters in place, we're going to have a real digital divide across the world, where folks that can afford these tools and technologies will take advantage of direct-to-consumer solutions. You know, there's self-insured entities in the US that are already thinking about this. And then everyone else is left to their own devices. So pragmatic and proactive policy, especially when it comes to making the required investments for reimbursement and also AI research, is critical, not only to facilitate the adoption of these tools, but to really make sure that we're inclusive and we don't create a digital divide, because again, this wave is coming and it's not going to stop.
Thank you so much. Gary, I think it kind of goes a little bit toward the direction that you've been just mentioning. So we need obviously to have the investment. We need to have interoperability of these applications of data to be able to feed the growing need to be also consumer centric. So in Europe, how do we make sure that obviously, I'll come back to some of these issues with other panelists, but since you were mentioning a focus on Europe to really work on the data spaces to make sure that we have everything that is necessary now to really speed up. We have heard also of fragmented regulations. So we talk about not only the fact that we don't necessarily have the reimbursement, that we don't have necessarily these incentives, but we do have very fragmented approach to some of that. So can we have a more, and what is potentially being done today to have more friendly, less fragmented markets to be able to test some of these solutions once they are there?
Yes. Yeah. Thanks very much. I mean, firstly, I think just to go back to as you mentioned, we've seen in with the result of the pandemic, a huge change in people's understanding of the power of AI and what it can do and how it can build resilience in all aspects of meeting the pandemic. And I think that this is going to be very powerful going forwards. And also that I think a broader view for listeners is that with the pandemic, with this extra thinking about the role of Europe generally in health aspects, that there's going to be a lot of thinking over the next year or so around a healthy union, and there's a big reflection process will start around the conference of Europe. But more specifically on this issue of fragmentation sharing, one of the initiatives I didn't quite get around to explaining first time around is this idea about, of course, the point of the European Health Data Space is to get the data accessible to those who need to use it to test and train their algorithms. And so this has got to be, a key goal, is how do we get this data to the best data, the data that's unbiased, representative, reflective perhaps of a European population to those who need it. And one of the ways in which we're thinking of doing it currently is this notion of testing and experimentation facilities, which the Commission is looking into for a number of sectors, one of which is health. And the concept would be for this to be a kind of one-stop shop, for there to be a few very large facilities of this kind, where an innovator could go towards the end stage of the development of their product just prior to seeking approvals, regulatory approvals. And they could test this with data, excellent quality data that they need at that stage, combined with physical resources, whether they're testing sort of robotics in a hospital, for example, and that this could combine in some way with a more Europeanized, joined-up approach to testing safety, to testing even economic aspects. So this could be a kind of a goal. I mean, certainly, I think what we're going to see with the advent of data is dramatic changes. I think how member states think about data flows within the healthcare system, how their the understanding of the need to create incentives and create skills in workforce. And I think we're going to see more joined up thinking across Europe because the digital transformation is just going to join up European healthcare systems much more than has been the case before. So I think we're seeing this on reimbursement. There's already discussion happening on, how can we, for telemedicine, for example, which we've seen vast growth in Europe, how can we get a more Europeanized approach to thinking about reimbursement on these issues? Or as I've been mentioning, the fact that we need to develop a more European approach to thinking about the secondary use of data and sharing data for research and innovation purposes. So I think we're going to see a lot of developments in these ways to defragment and create what the goal is, which is a digital single market for healthcare tools and services.
Excellent. And I think it's interesting also to estimate what is the role of pandemic in that when we actually need to go very quickly and when we need to react so that we can quickly save lives. I think a lot of these initiatives can speed up and be proved that there is an outcome that obviously is very beneficial. I believe we have another question in chat which can be relevant to what we just discussed. So Katarina, can you just please bring it?
Yes, we have received a question from Paul White. He asked, when talking on med professionals already keeping substantial amounts of data, are those data connected or somehow exchanged via global systems? And do we need a different set of regulation for local data, i.e. data that can be used in local setting or data traveling via internet? Thank you.
I can see, Sean, that probably is a great question for you, also from the perspective of experience, both at FDA and as an entrepreneur. So please, over to you.
Sure. So I think currently there are no global data exchange systems. And I think there are significant challenges for developing top-down approaches for data exchange. That's something that a lot of different countries have tried in the past decade as we started to venture into the world of electronic health records. There have been obviously consortia and centralized efforts to accommodate data exchange. However, there are bottlenecks with that type of top-down approach. What's happening in the U.S. Following the enactment of a law that Congress passed in late 2016 called the 21st Century Cures Act. One of the interesting features of that new piece of legislation was to start to transfer data ownership from systems in the United States to individuals. So this law was very specific in fact in terms of how that should be done. It mandated that all electronic health record providers should incorporate open APIs. These are smart on fire APIs that in fact are starting to scale globally. What that allows individuals to do now in the United States, these are the early days, is to extract their raw data from electronic health records, but also laboratories under smartphones. So in the United States, the iOS Apple device has an electronic health record feature now. And with the push of a button, in most cases, you can get most of your records, including laboratory. And then you can decide who you want to share it with. So if the current trends in the US continue in the next 5 years, patients would be the essential, basically a nucleus, that would be the nucleus for data exchange. And that's a completely different paradigm than having a systems-based approach. This is an individual-based approach for data sharing. And again, if the same trends continue to evolve over the next 5 to 10 years, it's reasonable to imagine that we're all going to have our data in the palm of our hands, and we'll decide who to exchange it with, whether it's with researchers or physician. I certainly did that, and I have a good portion of my data on my iPhone today, and it's quite amazing what we can extract using these APIs, given the fact that they've only been mandated for a few months. So I think exchanging data, probably the most scalable and the most appropriate and privacy preserving way of doing it is by transferring the ownership to the individual, to the patient.
Right. Thank you so much. We have actually run out of our hour. I would just like to give the floor for a minute to Philippe and to Gabriel. Is there anything else that you feel that hasn't been addressed and you would like to do that in a plenary? And then we're going to be moving to the breakout session through the link that's going to be posted here, so we can continue our discussion.
Maybe one comment, which might be a little bit naive. It's out of my scope and expertise, but I do feel that the main threat regarding data privacy, their primary issue is to preserve information about their disease, especially when it's severe disease, from being known by any other third party that will not be authorized. And I do believe that today the risk that this will happen through whatever information they share on the internet voluntarily, when they make search about their disease. In the US, when they are, when some of their data are captured through their consumer activity, including when they go and purchase drugs, is exposing their privacy sensitive data much, much more than what we are doing in the medical field. And I think we should have also that perspective on that topic. I think it's a very important one.
Thank you very much, Philippe. Gabriel, few last words.
So maybe if I can add a bit to this discussion on data privacy and maybe like where can policy help? And I think if we're talking about medical devices and AI in medical devices, in my experience, somehow there's already a lot of regulation in terms of data privacy. So I don't think that there's like a big gap there. And as also as has been said, I mean, the hospitals are already dealing with all of these very sensitive data. And I mean, definitely there's some things that change when you use machine learning, but I think what's crucial also, and where there's maybe a lack now, is more in terms of how to properly evaluate and develop these models. And I think there's all these regulations in terms, like generally for building medical products, and they obviously apply and they can be used. But what I see also with our customers is there's uncertainty on how far you need to go. And I think more detailed and clear norms, for instance, like a norm that says AI systems have to be built like this and they should be validated like this, would be useful. Like things like depending on the risk class, you need to have an external data set, or you don't, or you're not allowed to give your test data to your developers. Like things that I think apply in most of these projects. I mean, obviously there's also things that you can't. I mean, there's never going to be like a recipe and then you can just follow it. Like all these things are risk-based, so they differ very much in terms of application and product, but just a bit more detailed and clear norms for developing and validating and testing these systems, I think would go a long way. And it will also help speeding up the development, because a lot of companies we work with, they're not very sure like how far they need to go. And if they have these norms, they can say, okay, we're building on this like state-of-the-art norm, and then they're quicker in development.
Right. Thank you so much, Gabriel. So unfortunately, that's all what we could fit in a even now over an hour. So a big thank you to our great panelists, Ceri Thompson from EU Commission, Khozin from Janssen R&D, Gilles Lunzenfichter from Medisanté, Philippe Ryvlin of CHUV, and Gabriel Krummenacher of Zühlke. You can, if clicking on the chat, you will actually come to the breakout room. Our panelists have agreed graciously to allow us a few more minutes of their time, so we can continue in a more private setting, so to say, the discussion. I invite you to click on that and to be able to eventually ask some other questions. For those who want to grab a coffee, please do, and make sure that by 45, so by 5:45 you are back, because this is where we're going to be starting with preview of academic papers on AI governance, session 2. Thank you very much all.